Hi, everyone. This is Alex McCord at Johns Hopkins. In this lecture, we're going to be talking about federal, state, and local powers and what each level of government can do about gun violence. You've already heard a lot about the problem of gun violence in the United States. Many people, when faced with such a problem, will turn to public officials and government for solutions. So what can the government do to reduce gun violence? Well, in general, they can pass laws or implement policies. There are multiple levels of government. There's the federal government, state governments, and local governments. At each level, there is also administrative law, administrative agencies. In this lecture, we'll focus mostly on federal administrative agencies. Over the next few slides, I'll go over each level of government and administrative law separately. When we're talking about the federal government, we're talking about the three branches of government: the legislative branch, or Congress, the executive branch, normally thought of as the president, and the judicial branch, or the Supreme Court. Congress is limited to those powers that are enumerated by the Constitution. For example, Congress has the power to levy and collect taxes and to regulate interstate commerce. The Second Amendment to the Constitution limits some federal actions with respect to guns. We'll talk about the Second Amendment in detail in future lectures. There are three key pieces of historical legislation that have shaped current federal gun laws: the Gun Control Act of 1968, the Firearm Owners Protection Act of 1986, and the Brady Handgun Violence Prevention Act passed in 1993. The Gun Control Act of 1968 was passed by Congress and signed by Lyndon Johnson following the assassinations of John F. Kennedy, Robert Kennedy, and Martin Luther King. It clarified the basic framework for regulating firearm sales and licensing dealers. It created new prohibitions on importing certain guns. It limited imports to guns that were used for sporting purposes only. It also created basic categories of individuals to whom sale is prohibited. Those included felons, unlawful users of illegal substances, and those adjudicated mentally defective or committed to an institution. The Firearm Owners Protection Act was passed in 1986. It amended the Gun Control Act of 1968. It made it easier to sell guns without a license. It made private sales easier. It made it harder to convict sellers for gun sale violations, and even when they were convicted, it imposed lesser penalties. It also limited compliance inspections for licensees. So licensed gun dealers were investigated less often, and when they were investigated, it was with less stringency. This act also banned computerized records. It banned the government from collecting records about firearms sold and purchased. The Brady Handgun Violence Prevention Act, or the Brady Act, was passed in 1993. It's named after James Brady. James Brady was Ronald Reagan's press secretary, who was injured in a 1981 assassination attempt of Ronald Reagan. This bill was passed and signed by Bill Clinton in 1993. It required a background check for firearms sold by licensed dealers. To facilitate and simplify this background check requirement, it also instituted the National Instant Criminal Background Check System, which went into place in 1998. Importantly, the Brady Act did not require background checks for private transfers. It only required background checks for sales and transfers that occurred at licensed dealers, so gun stores or maybe big box stores like Walmart. These three laws, combined with a plethora of other federal laws, constitute federal gun law. Federal law contains some prohibitions, but not others. It prohibits felons, certain juvenile offenders, certain domestic abusers, certain individuals with severe mental illnesses, and others from purchasing firearms. Federal law does not require background checks or record keeping for private sales or transfers. Federal law also does not specifically govern civilian gun carrying in public. The only federal laws that deal with gun carrying deal specifically with where you can carry a gun. For example, you can't carry a gun into a federal court building. In general, many federal gun laws act as a floor rather than a ceiling. What I mean by this is that states and localities are able to build upon federal laws. Federal law creates the framework that states are allowed to build upon. I mentioned before that the Constitution enumerates certain powers for the federal government. Those powers that are not listed in the Constitution are left to the states by the 10th Amendment. One of those powers is the police power, which is the power that states have to protect the public's health, safety, and security. This power is particularly important for gun violence and gun violence prevention. States are also limited by what's contained in each state's constitution. The Second Amendment limits the federal government, but it also limits the state government. Like I said before, we'll talk about this in more detail in another lecture. States have more flexibility than the federal government. They can go further and do more with respect to guns. State laws may include additional prohibitors and standards for ownership. For example, states may require training before purchasing a firearm, or they may prohibit all violent misdemeanors from purchasing firearms. States may also institute private sale background checks. We'll go into more detail about private sale background check laws in a future lecture. States also may implement accountability measures like requiring serial number collection or handgun registration. States also have public carrying laws that govern who can carry a concealed firearm and where they can carry it. States also have design regulations. They may ban assault weapons or junk guns, which are cheap and dangerous guns. They may also regulate smart guns, which are guns that have technology that's designed to limit who can carry and use certain guns. Local governments are usually city, county, and municipal governments. They're usually made up of a mayor, city council, and city or county courts. Local governments often have the least power to regulate firearms, but they observe gun violence most directly at the city and county level. Local governments have police power like the states, but the extent of their police power is determined by the state government. Local power is often limited by preemption. When laws or policies from two levels of government come into conflict, the law from the higher level of government usually prevails. This is known generally as preemption. States can bar local cities, towns, and counties from passing gun-related legislation. They can do this expressly by passing a law that says that localities cannot pass gun laws, or they can do it impliedly by implying that localities cannot pass gun laws. Most local governments are given the power to protect public health and safety generally. However, firearm laws are often the main exception. Here's a map of state and local preemption laws. All the states in red have some form of a local preemption law. In these red states, cities and towns and other localities are not permitted to regulate firearms to an extent greater than the state. In the 5 blue states, Hawaii, New York, Massachusetts, Connecticut, and New Jersey, cities and towns are free to experiment when it comes to firearm regulation, even if it differs from state law. When we talk about administrative law, we're really talking about administrative agencies and rulemaking. This occurs at every level of government, but here we're going to talk about federal agencies. Federal agencies are tasked with regulating certain activities. For example, the Food and Drug Administration is tasked with regulating food and drugs. Agencies often engage in rulemaking, adjudication, and enforcement actions to implement and enforce laws passed by Congress. Here you can see 4 seals from federal agencies: the Department of Justice, the Department of Health and Human Services, the Consumer Product Safety Commission, and the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, Firearms, and Explosives. These are just 4 examples of many, many federal agencies. There's limited federal administrative authority over guns. The Consumer Product Safety Commission currently lacks authority to regulate guns. The CPSC, or Consumer Product Safety Commission, regulates most consumer goods, but does not regulate cars, guns, or drugs. These products are explicitly assigned to other agencies by federal law. For example, like I mentioned before, the FDA regulates drugs. The Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, Firearms, and Explosives, or ATF, has some power to regulate guns, but Congress has increasingly limited this power over time. This means that no federal agency has cohesive power over guns, which makes it difficult to impose regulations at the federal level. This distinguishes guns from products like cars. There are certain federal agencies that regulate cars. They regulate safety standards like seatbelts and airbags, and they also regulate highway safety. There's no such agency that regulates guns in this way. There are legal and political challenges at every level of government. One such challenge is the political power of opposition to any type of firearm law. A legal and political challenge is the Second Amendment to the Constitution. The legal challenges continue to evolve. There are new legal interpretations of the Second Amendment and associated rights and laws seemingly every year. And these continue as the Supreme Court is scheduled to consider a new Second Amendment case in 2019. So given these challenges, what can the government do to reduce gun violence? Well, despite these challenges, federal, state, and local governments can do a lot. Innovation has mostly occurred at the state level. This is because it's a lot easier to overcome many political challenges in state government. Most gun laws are state laws. However, there has been some recent momentum at the federal level. Firearms were a huge issue in the 2018 election, and in 2019, Congress has even considered some high-profile firearm legislation. Nonetheless, in the future, firearm laws will continue to occur for the most part at the state level.